Close your eyes and imagine the endless expanse of prairie grass bending under an unforgiving wind, where the horizon stretches so far it seems to swallow hope itself, and the only law is survival at any cost. In a place where daughters were considered burdens and horses were worth more than human souls, a 16-year-old girl found herself bargained away like livestock to satisfy her father's greed and desperation. This is her story. One of unimaginable betrayal, fierce resilience, and the discovery that sometimes salvation comes riding out of the wilderness in the form of a warrior whose own scars run deeper than the canyons that carved the land. And it's also the story of how a Lakota scout, bound by honor and haunted by loss, would risk everything to rewrite a destiny that seemed carved in stone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Nebraska Territory in 1867 was a place where dreams came to die under the weight of reality. The land stretched endlessly in all directions, a sea of grass broken only by occasional stands of cottonwood trees that marked the meandering paths of creeks and rivers. It was beautiful in its vastness, but that beauty was deceptive. Beneath the surface lay a harsh truth that broke more spirits than it ever lifted. This was the domain of homesteaders and fortune seekers, men and women who had traveled hundreds of miles with nothing but hope and determination, believing they could carve civilization out of wilderness through sheer force of will. Some succeeded, building thriving ranches and farms that would anchor communities for generations. But for every success story, there were dozens of failures, families who arrived with grand plans, only to discover that the prairie demanded more than they were capable of giving. The Hawthorne family had arrived in this unforgiving landscape. 3 years earlier, part of the wave of settlers drawn west by promises of free land and unlimited opportunity. What they found instead was a daily struggle against elements that seemed designed to test human endurance to its breaking point. Winters brought blizzards that could bury entire homesteads under walls of snow, while summers delivered droughts that turned fertile soil into dust and withered crops before they could mature. But perhaps the greatest challenge wasn't the weather, it was the isolation. The nearest neighbor might be 10 miles away, the closest town a full day's journey by wagon. When trouble came, and it always came, you faced it alone or not at all. This isolation bred a particular kind of hardness in those who survived, a pragmatic brutality that viewed everything, including family members, through the lens of survival value. Edgar Hawthorne's homestead sat in a shallow valley 20 miles, southeast of what would eventually become the town of Broken Bow. The location had seemed ideal when he first claimed it. Good water from a creek that ran year-round, fertile soil that promised abundant harvests, and enough timber along the creek bed to build a proper house and outbuildings. But 3 years of frontier life had taught Edgar that initial impressions meant nothing against the prairie's relentless hostility. His first wheat crop had been destroyed by hail the size of robin eggs. The second year brought a drought so severe that his corn withered to brown stalks before the ears could form. The third year started promisingly, until a grass fire, sparked by lightning and driven by prairie winds, swept across half his planted fields in a matter of hours. Each disaster had forced Edgar deeper into debt with the traders and merchants in North Platte, the nearest settlement large enough to extend credit. He owed money for seed, for supplies, for the tools that broke under the strain of frontier work and had to be replaced. Most crushing of all, he owed money for the additional horses and cattle he'd been convinced he needed to make his operation profitable. The homestead itself reflected the family's declining fortunes. What had begun as a sturdy log cabin had expanded haphazardly as Edgar added rooms and outbuildings without proper planning. The result was a rambling structure that looked more like several buildings accidentally pushed together than a coherent home. Gaps between the logs let in wind and rain, the roof leaked in a dozen places, and the whole structure seemed to sag under the weight of accumulated failures. Edgar himself had changed as much as his homestead over those 3 years. Once an optimistic man who spoke confidently about building a legacy for his children, he had become bitter and unpredictable, prone to explosive rages when things went wrong and long periods of sullen silence when they went right. At 45, he looked 60, his face weathered to leather by sun and wind, his eyes holding the haunted look of a man who had bet everything on a dream that was slowly turning into a nightmare. Edgar's wife, Margaret, had died during their second winter on the homestead, claimed by a fever that might have been treatable in a place with proper medical care, but proved fatal in the isolation of the prairie. Her death had left Edgar to raise their 2 children alone, a responsibility he had never wanted and proved incapable of handling with any grace or compassion. The children were Rebecca, now 16, and her younger brother Timothy, who had just turned 13. Both had been forced to grow up quickly in the harsh environment of the homestead, taking on adult responsibilities while still trying to navigate the normal challenges of adolescence. Rebecca Hawthorne possessed a beauty that seemed almost out of place in the harsh prairie environment. Her auburn hair caught sunlight like spun copper, and her green eyes held depths that spoke of intelligence and spirit that frontier life hadn't yet managed to crush. She had inherited her mother's grace and gentle nature, but 3 years of frontier hardship had also given her a strength and resilience that would have impressed the most seasoned pioneer women. At 16, Rebecca had essentially become the woman of the household, managing the cooking, cleaning, and countless other domestic tasks that kept the homestead functioning. She tended the family's small vegetable garden, milked their cow, gathered eggs from their chickens, and helped with the heavier farm work when Edgar's drinking left him incapable of handling his responsibilities. But Rebecca's most important role was protecting her younger brother from their father's increasingly violent temper. Timothy was a gentle boy who had never fully adapted to the brutal realities of frontier life. He was intelligent and sensitive, qualities that Edgar viewed as weaknesses that needed to be beaten out of him. When Edgar's frustrations boiled over into physical violence, it was usually Timothy who bore the brunt of his father's rage. Rebecca had learned to read the warning signs of her father's approaching explosions, the way his jaw would clench when he studied their dwindling finances, the particular quality of silence that filled the cabin when he'd been drinking, the dangerous glitter in his eyes when something reminded him of all his failures. When she saw these signs, she would find ways to distract Edgar's attention or remove Timothy from harm's way. This constant vigilance had made Rebecca wise beyond her years, but it had also isolated her from the normal experiences of teenage life. While girls her age in more settled areas might be attending social gatherings or receiving visits from young suitors, Rebecca's world was bounded by the immediate needs of survival and the ongoing effort to maintain peace in a household. Always teetering on the edge of disaster, Timothy Hawthorne represented everything Edgar had hoped his son wouldn't become. Instead of the tough, pragmatic boy who could help build the family's fortunes, Timothy was bookish and thoughtful, more interested in the natural world around him than in the brutal work of wresting a living from reluctant soil. The boy had taught himself to read using the few books their mother had brought west, and he spent hours studying the behavior of prairie animals, the patterns of weather and seasons, the complex relationships between plants and soil that made the difference between successful and failed crops. This knowledge should have made him valuable to his father's farming efforts, but Edgar saw Timothy's intellectual approach to problems as evidence of weakness and impracticality. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. "The boy thinks too much," Edgar would mutter during his drinking. Sessions. Out here you don't think, you work. You don't study the land, you make it do what you want or you starve. Edgar's attempts to toughen up his son had grown increasingly violent over the past year. Timothy bore the marks of these lessons in bruises that never quite healed before new ones appeared. In the way he flinched at sudden movements, in the carefully neutral expression he wore whenever his father was present. Rebecca watched her brother's spirit being systematically crushed and felt helpless to prevent it. She could intervene in the worst moments, distracting Edgar or absorbing some of his violence herself, but she couldn't change the fundamental dynamic that was slowly destroying Timothy's sense of self-worth and hope for the future. The boy had begun talking about running away, seeking his fortune in California, or joining one of the wagon trains that still passed through the territory heading west. Rebecca lived in constant fear that one morning she would wake to find Timothy gone, driven away by desperation and leaving her alone to face their father's increasingly unstable behavior. By the spring of 1867, Edgar Hawthorne's financial situation had reached a critical point. The debts he had accumulated over 3 years of failed harvests and poor decisions now totaled more than $1,500. A staggering sum for a homesteader whose best year had generated barely $300 in income. The creditors in North Platte had been patient at first, understanding that frontier farming was a risky proposition that required time to show profits. But patience had limits, and Edgar had reached them. Jeremiah Walsh, who owned the largest general store in North Platte and held notes for most of Edgar's debts, had made it clear that payment was due by the end of summer or legal action would follow. "I've got other folks depending on me too, Edgar," Walsh had explained during their last meeting. "I can't carry your debts forever, especially when I don't see any sign that you're going to be able to pay them back. You need to find a way to settle up, or I'll have to send the sheriff out to collect what he can." The threat of losing the homestead terrified Edgar, not because he loved the land, he had come to hate every acre of it, but because losing it would mean admitting complete failure. Everything he had sacrificed to come west, including his wife's life, would have been for nothing. He would be forced to return east as a broken man, assuming he could even afford the journey back to civilization. Edgar had tried everything he could think of to raise the money. He had sold most of their livestock, keeping only what was absolutely necessary for basic operations. He had mortgaged their few valuable possessions. He had even swallowed his pride and written letters to relatives back east, begging for loans that never materialized. The only assets of significant value that Edgar still possessed were his horses. He owned 4 animals, 2 work horses necessary for plowing and hauling, and 2 riding horses that he had purchased during his more optimistic early days on the homestead. The riding horses were quality animals, worth perhaps $200 each if he could find the right buyer, but selling the horses would leave the family with no means of transportation and would make certain types of farm work impossible. It was a desperate measure that would solve his immediate financial crisis while creating new long-term problems. Edgar knew this, but as the summer deadline approached, desperation was beginning to override practical considerations. The solution to Edgar's dilemma arrived unexpectedly on a sweltering July morning in the form of a horse trader named Silas Crenshaw. Crenshaw was a weathered man in his 50s who made his living buying and selling horses throughout the territory, dealing with ranchers, farmers, and anyone else who needed quality animals or had them to sell. Crenshaw's reputation was mixed. He was known to be an excellent judge of horseflesh and honest in his dealings regarding the animals themselves, but he was also known to be ruthless in business negotiations and willing to take advantage of desperate sellers. Men who dealt with Crenshaw often walked away feeling like they had been cheated, even when the terms of their agreements were technically fair. On this particular morning, Crenshaw arrived at the Hawthorne homestead, driving a wagon loaded with supplies and leading a string of 6 horses. He was scouting the area for animals to buy, having heard through the network of traders and merchants that several homesteaders in the region were struggling financially and might be willing to part with livestock. Edgar met Crenshaw in the yard, in front of the cabin, his manner immediately shifting to the overly friendly demeanor he adopted whenever he sensed a potential business opportunity. Rebecca watched from the cabin doorway, instinctively wary of strangers who arrived unannounced, especially ones who looked as calculating as Silas Crenshaw. "Heard you might have some horses for sale," Crenshaw said without preamble, his pale eyes surveying the Hawthorne property with the practiced assessment of a man who could estimate someone's financial situation at a glance. Edgar tried to project confidence and prosperity, but his desperation was too obvious to hide completely. "I might be willing to part with a few animals, depending on the offer," he replied. "Got some fine stock that would suit a man who knows quality when he sees it." Crenshaw nodded non-committally and asked to see the horses. Edgar led him to the corral where the 4 animals stood in the afternoon heat, their coats gleaming with health despite the family's financial struggles. Rebecca had made sure the horses were well cared for, understanding instinctively that they might represent the family's last hope for avoiding complete disaster. The trader examined each animal with professional thoroughness, checking teeth, feeling legs for soundness, observing how the horses moved and responded to handling. His expression revealed nothing, but Rebecca could see that he was impressed by the quality of the animals her father had to offer. After completing his examination, Crenshaw returned to where Edgar waited with poorly concealed anxiety. "The work horses are solid, but nothing special," he announced. "I could offer you $40 each for them, which is fair considering their age and condition." Edgar's face fell. $80 wouldn't make a significant dent in his debts, and selling the workhorses would cripple his farming operation. But Crenshaw wasn't finished. The riding horses, though, those are different animals entirely. Quality breeding, good conformation, well trained. I could find buyers who would pay premium prices for horses like that. He paused, letting Edgar's hope build before delivering his offer. "I'd be willing to pay $300 for the pair. $380 total would cover about a quarter of Edgar's debts. Not enough to solve his problems, but enough to buy him time to find another solution." It was a reasonable offer, perhaps even a generous one, but it still left Edgar facing financial ruin within a matter of months. Edgar's disappointment was visible, and Crenshaw read it accurately. "I can see that's not enough to solve whatever problems you're facing," the trader said, with apparent sympathy. "What kind of money would it take to get you out of trouble?" The question was like opening a dam. Edgar found himself confessing the full extent of his financial difficulties, describing the mounting debts and the summer deadline and the threat of losing everything he had worked to build. It was the kind of desperate honesty that shrewd men like Crenshaw knew how to exploit. Crenshaw listened with expressions of concern and understanding, occasionally asking questions that drew out additional details about Edgar's situation. When the confession was complete, he stood in thoughtful silence for several minutes, as if wrestling with a difficult decision. "I might be able to help you," he finally said, "but it would require a different kind of arrangement than a simple horse sale." What Silas Crenshaw proposed next would haunt Rebecca Thornfield for the rest of her life. The trader had noticed her beauty from the moment he arrived at the homestead, and his business instincts had immediately begun calculating how that beauty might be converted into profit. "I know a man up in Dakota Territory," Crenshaw explained to Edgar in the tone of someone sharing a confidence. "Fellow named Harcourt who's built himself quite an operation up there. Cattle ranch, trading post, several other business interests. He's a man of substantial means, but he's been looking for a wife. The right kind of wife." Edgar listened with growing unease, beginning to understand where this conversation was heading, but not yet willing to believe that Crenshaw was suggesting what he seemed to be suggesting. Harcourt's particular about what he wants, Crenshaw continued. Young, beautiful, from a decent family. He's willing to pay handsomely for the right arrangement. We're talking about enough money to clear your debts and set you up with a fresh start. The words hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Edgar stared at Crenshaw, his mind struggling to process the enormity of what was being proposed. The trader was talking about selling Rebecca, his own daughter, like livestock. "You're talking about my daughter," Edgar said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm talking about solving your problems," Crenshaw replied matter-of-factly. "Your daughter is a beautiful young woman who would make an excellent wife for a man of Harcourt's standing. In exchange for arranging the marriage, he would pay enough to clear your debts and provide you with capital to make a real success of this homestead." Rebecca, who had been listening from the cabin doorway, felt the world tilt around her. She gripped the doorframe to keep from falling, her mind refusing to accept what she was hearing. Her own father was being offered money to sell her to a stranger, and he wasn't immediately rejecting the proposal with the outrage it deserved. "How much money?" Edgar asked, and with those 4 words he crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Crenshaw smiled, recognizing that he had found his mark. $1,500, he said, "enough to pay off every debt you owe and leave you with money left over to make this place profitable." The exact amount of Edgar's debts. Crenshaw had calculated his offer precisely, making it impossible for Edgar to claim that the money wouldn't solve his problems. It was a lifeline thrown to a drowning man, even if accepting it meant sacrificing his daughter's future. Edgar's internal struggle was visible on his weathered face. Whatever remained of his paternal instincts warred against the desperation that had been consuming him for months. He looked toward the cabin where Rebecca stood frozen in the doorway, her face pale with shock and betrayal. "She's only 16, he said weakly, grasping for reasons to reject an offer that part of him desperately wanted to accept. "Perfect age for a young wife," Crenshaw replied. "Old enough to manage a household and bear children, young enough to adapt to her new circumstances. Harcourt specifically requested someone of that age." Rebecca found her voice at last, though. It came out as little more than a broken whisper. "Papa, no!" Edgar avoided his daughter's eyes, unable to face the accusation he saw there. "I need time to think about this," he told Crenshaw. "Time's the one thing you don't have," the trader replied. "I'm heading north day after tomorrow, and if I'm going to make this arrangement, it needs to happen before I leave. Harcourt's expecting me to bring him a bride, and he doesn't like to be disappointed." The pressure was carefully calculated. Crenshaw knew that given time to consider the moral implications of what he was being asked to do, Edgar might find the strength to refuse. But pressure and desperation together could overcome moral objections, especially in a man who had already sacrificed so much for survival. Edgar looked around at his failing homestead, at the ramshackle buildings and withered fields that represented years of backbreaking work and bitter disappointment. Then he looked at his daughter, 16 years old and beautiful and innocent, the one thing of value he still possessed in a world that had taken everything else. "What kind of man is this, Harcourt?" he asked, and Rebecca knew with sick certainty that her father was going to betray her. "Successful businessman, well respected in his community. He'd provide your daughter with a comfortable life, much better than what she could expect out here." Crenshaw's description was carefully sanitized, revealing nothing about Harcourt's true nature or the reasons why a wealthy man would need to purchase a bride rather than courting one through normal means. Edgar nodded slowly, his decision crystallizing even as his daughter's world crumbled around her. "If I agree to this, when would she have to leave?" "Tomorrow afternoon. I'll take her north with me, deliver her to Harcourt, and bring back your money." simple and clean. Rebecca's legs finally gave out, and she sank to her knees in the doorway, overwhelmed by the realization that her father was actually going to sell her to satisfy his debts. Everything she had believed about their family, about her importance to her father, about her future, had been revealed as illusion in the space of a single conversation. Timothy appeared beside his sister, having heard enough of the conversation to understand what was happening. At 13, he was old enough to comprehend the horror of what their father was contemplating, and his face reflected the same shock and betrayal that Rebecca felt. "Papa, you can't do this," Timothy said, his voice cracking with emotion. "She's your daughter." Edgar finally looked at his children, and for a moment his resolve seemed to waver. But then his gaze shifted to the crumbling homestead around them, to the reality of the debts that would destroy them all if not addressed. And his expression hardened again. "Sometimes a man has to make hard choices to protect his family," he said, the words sounding hollow even to himself. "This isn't protecting us," Rebecca managed to say through her tears. "This is selling me." Edgar turned away, unable to face the truth in his daughter's words. "I'll give you my answer in the morning," he told Crenshaw. The trader nodded, satisfied that he had won. "I'll be back at sunrise for your decision. But I think we both know what that decision is going to be." That night was the longest of Rebecca Hawthorne's young life. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the familiar sounds of the prairie night, wind through the grass, the distant call of coyotes, the settling of the cabin's timbers as the temperature dropped. Tomorrow, if her father followed through on his implicit agreement with Crenshaw, she would leave this place forever. She would be taken north to Dakota Territory to marry a stranger who had paid for her like livestock. Everything she had ever known, everyone she had ever loved, would be left behind in service of her father's debts. The injustice of it was staggering. She had worked tirelessly to keep the household functioning, had sacrificed her own dreams and desires to care for her family, had endured years of hardship without complaint. And in return, her father was prepared to trade her away to solve problems of his own making. Timothy crept into her room sometime after midnight, his face streaked with tears. "We could run away," he whispered urgently. "Leave tonight, before. Papa can go through with this." Rebecca considered it. They could take one of the horses, head for North Platte or some other settlement where they might find work or assistance. But Edgar would come after them, and even if they escaped, they would be two children alone in a hostile wilderness with no resources and no plan for survival. "Where would we go?" she asked gently. "How would we live?" Timothy had no answer. He was 13 years old, with no skills that would allow him to support himself, much less his sister. Running away would likely lead to starvation or worse for both of them. "I'll find a way to come back for you," Timothy promised, though they both knew it was an empty vow. "I'll make money somehow, and I'll buy you back from this Harcourt." Rebecca pulled her brother close, drawing comfort from his presence while she still could. "You concentrate on taking care of yourself," she told him. "Don't worry about me. I'll find a way to survive this." She hoped her voice carried more confidence than she felt. The truth was that she had no idea what lay ahead, no knowledge of the man she was being sold to or the life that awaited her in Dakota Territory. All she knew was that tomorrow would mark the end of everything she had ever known, and the beginning of a future that terrified her beyond words. Dawn came too soon, and not soon enough. Rebecca had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep near morning, only to be awakened by the sound of approaching horses. Through her window, she could see Silas Crenshaw returning as promised, leading a wagon that would presumably carry her away from everything she had ever known. Edgar was already awake, pacing the main room of the cabin with the restless energy of a man trying to convince himself he was doing the right thing. He had been drinking. Rebecca could smell the whiskey on his breath, but not enough to provide the excuse of intoxication for what he was about to do. Crenshaw knocked on the cabin door with the confidence of a man who knew his offer would be accepted. Edgar opened it immediately, as if he had been waiting for this moment to arrive so he could finally end his internal struggle. "Have you reached a decision?" Crenshaw asked. Though his tone suggested he already knew the answer, Edgar nodded slowly. "I accept your terms." With those 4 words, Edgar Hawthorne sealed his daughter's fate and destroyed whatever remained of his family. Rebecca, listening from her bedroom, felt something break inside her chest, not her heart, which she had thought was already broken, but something deeper and more fundamental. Her faith in human decency, perhaps, or her belief that love could overcome greed and desperation. Crenshaw smiled with satisfaction. "Excellent. I'll need the girl ready to travel within the hour. The journey to Dakota Territory takes several days, and I want to get started while the weather holds." Rebecca forced herself to stand and begin gathering her few possessions. She owned almost nothing of value: a few dresses her mother had made for her, some books that had belonged to her mother, a small collection of personal items that held sentimental but no monetary worth. Everything that truly mattered, her home, her family, her freedom, was being left behind. Timothy appeared in her doorway, his face swollen from crying. "I won't let him forget what he's doing," he promised, with the fierce intensity that only a 13-year-old could muster. "Every day for the rest of his life, I'll make sure he remembers that he sold his own daughter." Rebecca knew that Timothy meant every word, and she felt sorry for both him and their father. Edgar's betrayal would poison whatever relationship remained between father and son, ensuring that Timothy would grow up carrying the burden of hatred and resentment. In trying to save his family through this terrible bargain, Edgar was actually destroying it completely. When Rebecca finally emerged from her room carrying her small bundle of belongings, she found her father waiting with Crenshaw in the main room. Edgar couldn't meet her eyes, but Crenshaw examined her with the appraising look of a man evaluating merchandise. "She'll clean up nice," he observed with casual brutality. "Harcourt will be pleased with the arrangement." Edgar flinched at the trader's words, perhaps finally understanding how his daughter's sale appeared to outside eyes. But it was too late for second thoughts. The agreement had been made, and men like Crenshaw didn't allow their business partners to change their minds once money was involved. "The payment will be delivered when I return from Dakota Territory," Crenshaw explained. "Should be back in about 3 weeks with your $1,500. Edgar nodded, his attention focused on the promised money rather than on his daughter's white face and trembling hands. Rebecca realized that he had already begun the mental process of justifying his actions, telling himself that he was sacrificing one family member to save the others. "Time to go," Crenshaw announced, hefting Rebecca's small bundle and heading for the door. Rebecca followed numbly, feeling as though she were walking through a nightmare from which she couldn't wake. At the wagon, Crenshaw helped her climb onto the wooden seat beside him, his hands lingering longer than necessary in a way that made her skin crawl. As the wagon began to move, Rebecca looked back at the ramshackle homestead that had been her entire world. Timothy stood in the yard, tears streaming down his face as he watched his sister being taken away. Edgar remained in the doorway, but he had turned his back to the departing wagon, unable or unwilling to witness the final moment of his betrayal. The last thing Rebecca saw before the homestead disappeared behind a rise in the prairie was Timothy, raising his hand in farewell, a gesture that seemed to promise that someone would remember her and mourn her loss, even if her own father could not. Then she was alone with Silas Crenshaw, heading north toward an unknown fate with a man whose name she didn't even know, purchased like livestock to satisfy another man's desires and her father's debts. At 16 years old, Rebecca Hawthorne's childhood had ended not gradually, as it did for most people, but in a single moment of betrayal that would echo through the rest of her life. The wagon rolled north across the endless prairie, carrying its human cargo toward a destiny that neither Rebecca nor anyone else could have imagined. The first day of Rebecca Hawthorne's journey north passed in a haze of numbness and disbelief. Silas Crenshaw drove the wagon with the casual efficiency of a man who had made this route many times before, his weathered hands steady on the reins as they navigated the rutted trails that connected scattered homesteads across the Nebraska territory. Rebecca sat beside him in rigid silence, her small bundle of possessions clutched in her lap like a shield against the reality of what was happening to her. Every mile that passed beneath the wagon wheels carried her further from everything she had ever known, deeper into a nightmare that seemed too surreal to be actually occurring. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, an ocean of grass that undulated in the wind like waves on some vast green sea. Under different circumstances, Rebecca might have found beauty in the landscape's stark grandeur, but now it felt like a prison without walls, trapping her in a journey she had never chosen toward a fate she couldn't imagine. Crenshaw made no effort at conversation during those first hours, seemingly content to let his human cargo adjust to her new circumstances in whatever way she could manage. When he did speak, it was only to issue brief instructions about when they would stop to rest the horses or where she should relieve herself when nature called. His tone was neither cruel nor kind, simply businesslike, as if he were transporting any other piece of valuable merchandise. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson that reminded Rebecca painfully of home, Crenshaw finally broke the extended silence with words that chilled her to the bone. "Best if you understand the situation you're in," he said without looking at her, his voice carrying the flat authority of a man stating indisputable facts. "You belong to me now until I deliver you to Harcourt. Your father signed papers transferring custody, which means you're my property, same as these horses. Try to run, and I'll track you down and bring you back. Try to cause trouble, and I'll make sure you regret it." Rebecca's hands tightened on her bundle, but she forced herself to meet his pale eyes. "I'm not property," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I'm a human being." Crenshaw's laugh was as cold as winter wind. "Out here, girl, you're whatever someone with power says you are. Your father had the power to sell you. I have the power to transport you, and Harcourt has the power to do whatever he wants with you once you're his wife. That's the way the world works, when you don't have money or influence to protect yourself." The brutal honesty of his words hit Rebecca like a physical blow. In her sheltered life on the homestead, she had been protected from the harshest realities of how power operated in the world beyond her family's small sphere. Now she was learning lessons that no 16-year-old should have to absorb about her own vulnerability and the casual cruelty that men could display toward those they saw as beneath them. "What kind of man is this Harcourt?" she asked, dreading the answer, but needing to know what awaited her at the end of this journey. Crenshaw considered the question for a long moment before responding. "Rich, powerful, used to getting what he wants without asking twice." He glanced at her sideways, his expression unreadable. "He's had 3 wives before you. The first one died in childbirth. The second one ran off with a traveling preacher. The third one, well, let's just say she met with an unfortunate accident." Rebecca felt ice water flowing through her veins. "You're taking me to a man who's killed his wife?" "I'm taking you to a man who pays well for quality merchandise," Crenshaw corrected. "What happens after that is between you and him. My job is delivery, not guaranteeing what comes after." As darkness fell across the prairie, Crenshaw guided the wagon toward a small grove of cottonwood trees that marked the presence of a creek. This was clearly a regular camping spot for travelers. Rebecca could see the remains of old campfires and areas where the grass had been worn away by horses and wagons. Crenshaw unhitched the horses and led them to water, while Rebecca sat frozen on the wagon seat, unsure what was expected of her in this new reality. When he returned, he began setting up camp with practiced efficiency, building a fire and preparing a simple meal of hardtack and beans from his supplies. "You'll sleep in the wagon," he told her as he stirred the beans over the fire. "I'll be sleeping nearby, and I'm a light sleeper. Don't get any ideas about trying to slip away in the night." Rebecca climbed into the wagon bed, which Crenshaw had arranged with blankets to serve as a makeshift bedroom. The accommodations were crude, but not deliberately uncomfortable. Apparently, he wanted his merchandise to arrive in good condition. As she lay there listening to the sounds of the prairie night, the distant howl of coyotes, the rustle of wind, through grass, the occasional snort from the horses, Rebecca tried to make sense of her situation. Less than 24 hours ago, she had been Rebecca Hawthorne, beloved daughter and protective sister, dreaming of a future that might include love and family and all the normal hopes of a young woman. Now she was Rebecca Nobody, a piece of property being transported to a man who might well murder her, as he apparently had his previous wife. The transformation was so complete and so sudden that part of her mind refused to accept it as real. But the hard wooden floor of the wagon bed was real enough, as was the sound of Silas Crenshaw settling down to sleep nearby, his rifle within easy reach in case his valuable cargo tried to escape. This was her new reality, no matter how impossible it seemed. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of Timothy's tear-streaked face and her father's averted eyes, images that would haunt her for years to come. The second day of travel brought them to a ramshackle trading post called Morrison's Station, little more than a collection of rough buildings clustered around a well in the middle of nowhere. The post served travelers moving along the network of trails that connected the scattered settlements of the territory, offering supplies, information, and temporary refuge from the loneliness of the prairie. Crenshaw pulled the wagon up to the main building and climbed down to speak with the proprietor, a grizzled man named Morrison, who emerged from the doorway, wiping his hands on a greasy apron. Rebecca remained in the wagon as instructed, but she could hear fragments of their conversation that made her blood run cold. "Got the merchandise you mentioned last time through," Crenshaw was saying in a low voice that didn't carry far beyond. Where Morrison stood, "Young one, ain't she?" Morrison replied, glancing toward the wagon where Rebecca sat. "Harcourt likes them young, but that one looks like she might not last long in his tender care." Crenshaw shrugged. "Not my problem once I collect my fee. Girls signed for and paid for. What Harcourt does with his property after that is his business." Morrison nodded and disappeared back into his building, returning a few minutes later with a bottle of whiskey and some additional supplies. As he handed them to Crenshaw, he spoke in a voice just loud enough for Rebecca to hear. "Might want to enjoy the next few days of travel," he said with a cruel smile. "Once you get to Harcourt's place, that girl's going to learn what real suffering feels like." The words were clearly intended to frighten Rebecca, and they succeeded completely. Morrison's casual cruelty, combined with Crenshaw's indifference to her fate, drove home the reality that she was truly alone in a world that saw her as nothing, more than an object to be bought and sold. As they prepared to leave Morrison's Station, Rebecca noticed something that made her situation seem even more hopeless. Other travelers at the post, men on horseback, families in wagons, traders with pack animals, all seemed to understand exactly what was happening. They looked at her with expressions ranging from pity to disgust, but none showed any inclination to intervene or offer assistance. This was apparently a common enough sight on the frontier that no one found it worth questioning. Young women being transported against their will was simply part of the brutal reality of life in the territories, accepted by everyone as the natural order of things. On the third day of their journey, the weather turned threatening as massive thunderheads built up along the western horizon. Crenshaw watched the approaching storm with obvious concern, clearly familiar with how quickly prairie weather could turn deadly. "We need to find shelter," he muttered, scanning the empty landscape for any sign of protection from the approaching tempest. "These plains storms can kill you if you're caught in the open." As if summoned by his words, lightning began flickering through the dark clouds, followed by the distant rumble of thunder. The wind picked up, bending the grass flat and filling the air with the smell of rain and ozone that promised a violent downpour. Crenshaw spotted what he was looking for, a small abandoned cabin sitting in a depression about a mile off the main trail. The structure looked like it had been vacant for years, probably the remains of some homesteader's failed attempt to claim a piece of the prairie. But it had 4 walls and most of a roof, which made it better shelter than the open wagon. They reached the cabin just as the first fat raindrops began falling from the increasingly dark sky. Crenshaw quickly unhitched the horses and led them to a lean-to structure behind the cabin that provided minimal protection from the elements. Then he grabbed his rifle and supplies and motioned for Rebecca to follow him into the cabin. The interior was a single room with gaps between the logs that let in wind and rain, but it was still better than being exposed to the full fury of the approaching storm. Crenshaw immediately began checking the perimeter, looking for any other entrances or weaknesses that might allow his captive to escape. As thunder crashed overhead and rain began hammering against the cabin's roof, Rebecca found herself trapped, in close quarters with her captor for the first time since their journey began. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm of fear and revulsion that raged within her as she realized how vulnerable she was in this isolated place. As the storm raged outside, Silas Crenshaw began drinking from the bottle of whiskey he had acquired at Morrison Station. With each sip, his carefully maintained facade of professional detachment began to slip away, revealing the predator that lurked beneath. "You know what your problem is, girl?" he said, his words beginning to slur slightly as the alcohol took. "Effect, you still think you're somebody special, still think you deserve better than what you're getting." Rebecca pressed herself against the far wall of the cabin, as far from Crenshaw as the small space would allow. "I think I deserve to be treated like a human being," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady despite her growing fear. Crenshaw laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Human being? You're 16 years old with no money, no family that wants you, and no skills that anyone values. The only thing you've got worth anything is that pretty face and young body, and that's exactly what you're being sold for." He took another long pull from the bottle, his pale eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Your father understood that. He knew you were just another mouth to feed, another burden dragging down his chances of survival. Smart man, trading his liability for hard cash." "My father loves me," Rebecca said, though the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "Your father sold you to pay his debts," Crenshaw corrected with brutal honesty. "If he loved you, would he have let me take you away to marry a man who's probably going to kill you within a year? Love doesn't put $1,500 in a man's pocket." The cruel logic of his words cut deep, because Rebecca couldn't entirely dispute them. Her father had made his choice, and that choice revealed the true value he placed on his daughters: life and happiness. Crenshaw stood up, swaying slightly from the whiskey, and began moving closer to where Rebecca sat against the wall. "You know what I think?" he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I think you need to start learning what your new life is going to be like. Might as well start with me." Rebecca's heart began racing as she realized what he was suggesting. She looked toward the cabin door, but Crenshaw anticipated her thoughts and stepped between her and the only exit. "Storm's still raging out there," he said with a predatory smile. "Nobody else for miles around. Just you and me, and all night to get acquainted." What happened next would be burned into Rebecca's memory forever. As Crenshaw lunged toward her, something fierce and desperate awakened within her, a survival instinct that had been dormant during the numbing shock of the past 3 days. She rolled aside just as his hands reached for her, grabbing a piece of broken pottery from the cabin floor and slashing at his face with all the strength she could muster. The sharp edge opened a gash across his cheek, and he roared with pain and rage as blood began flowing down his face. "You little wildcat," he snarled, touching the wound and staring at the blood on his fingers. "I was going to be gentle with you, but now you're going to learn what happens to merchandise that damages the goods." Rebecca scrambled to her feet, the broken pottery still clutched in her hand like a weapon. "Stay away from me," she warned, surprised by the steel in her own voice. "I'll fight you every step of the way." Crenshaw's laugh was ugly and full of promise. "Fight all you want, makes it more interesting for me, and it won't change what's going to happen." He came at her again, but this time Rebecca was ready. She had grown up on a frontier homestead where physical labor was a daily necessity, and 3 years of hard work had given her more strength than her slender frame suggested. When Crenshaw grabbed for her wrist, she twisted away and brought her knee up hard between his legs. The trader doubled over with a howl of agony, giving Rebecca the opening she needed to dash toward the cabin door. But Crenshaw recovered faster than she had hoped, catching her ankle and sending her crashing to the floor just inches from freedom. "Now you've made me angry," he gasped, still struggling to catch his breath from her knee strike. "And when I'm angry, I stop being careful about keeping the merchandise in perfect condition." What saved Rebecca Hawthorne in that desperate moment wasn't her own strength or courage, though she had shown plenty of both. It was the prairie storm itself, which chose that exact instant to demonstrate the awesome power of nature unleashed. A bolt of lightning, attracted by some metal object, in or near the cabin, struck with a thunderclap so loud it seemed to shake the earth itself. The blast of light was blinding, and the immediate thunder was so powerful that both Rebecca and Crenshaw were momentarily stunned into immobility. In the aftermath of the lightning strike, they could hear new sounds from outside. The horses, screaming in terror, the crash of falling timber, and something else that made Crenshaw's face go pale, despite his alcohol-fueled rage. Voices, human voices, calling out in a language that Rebecca didn't recognize, but that made Crenshaw grab his rifle and move cautiously toward the cabin's single window. "Indians," he muttered, peering out into the storm-lashed darkness, "probably just seeking shelter from the storm, same as us. If we're quiet, they might not know we're here." But Rebecca's desperate situation had given her a different perspective. On the arrival of these unexpected visitors, anyone who represented a potential disruption to Crenshaw's plans was welcome, regardless of who they might be or what their intentions were. Before Crenshaw could stop her, she opened her mouth and screamed at the top of her lungs, a cry of desperation and appeal that cut through the storm's noise like a knife through silk. Crenshaw spun toward her with murderous fury in his eyes, but it was too late. The voices outside had heard her scream and were moving closer to the cabin, calling out words that sounded like questions or challenges. "You stupid girl," Crenshaw snarled, raising his rifle toward the door. "You might have just got us both killed." But Rebecca had made her choice. Whatever fate awaited her with these unknown visitors, it couldn't be worse than what Crenshaw had planned for her in the isolation of this abandoned cabin. The cabin door opened with a crash that seemed to shake the entire structure, and through the opening stepped a figure that would change the course of Rebecca's life forever. The man who entered was tall and lean, with the fluid movements of someone who had spent his entire life in harmony with the natural world around him. He was clearly Native American, though Rebecca's limited experience didn't allow her to identify his specific tribe. His long black hair was braided and decorated with beads and feathers, and his clothing was a mixture of traditional native garments and practical frontier wear adapted for long-distance travel. But it was his eyes that captured Rebecca's attention. Dark and intelligent, holding depths of wisdom and pain that spoke of experiences far beyond his apparent age. This was a man who had seen both the beauty and the brutality of the world, and who had somehow managed to maintain his humanity despite whatever hardships he had endured. He surveyed the scene inside the cabin with swift comprehension. The frightened young woman pressed against the wall, the angry man with a rifle and blood on his face, the clear evidence of a struggle that had been interrupted by his arrival. When he spoke, it was in accented but clear English, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to fill the small space. "You will put down the weapon," he said to Crenshaw, though his tone suggested it was more command than request. Crenshaw's response was predictable. "This is none of your business, Indian. The girl belongs to me, and I'll do what I want with my property." The newcomer's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the atmosphere of the cabin, a sense of danger that had nothing to do with the storm raging outside. "She is not property," he said quietly. "She is a human being, in distress, and that makes it my business." Rebecca found her voice at last. "Please," she said, looking directly into those dark eyes. "He's taking me against my will to a man who's going to hurt me. My father sold me like I was livestock." For a moment, the only sounds in the cabin were the rain hammering against the roof and the distant rumble of thunder. Then the Lakota scout took a step forward, and Rebecca could see Crenshaw's knuckles whiten as he gripped his rifle more tightly. "My name is Joseph Crow Feather," the scout said, speaking to Rebecca, though his eyes never left Crenshaw. "I am traveling south with my uncle and 2 cousins when the storm forced us to seek shelter. We heard your cry for help." Crenshaw raised his rifle slightly, pointing it more directly at Joseph. "I don't care what your name is or why you're here. This girl is mine by legal right, and I'm taking her north to her new husband. You and your friends need to move along before this gets ugly." Joseph's smile was as cold as winter wind. "It is already ugly," he said. "The question is whether you are wise enough to make it less ugly or foolish enough to make it much worse." What happened next unfolded with the lightning-fast precision of a deadly dance that had been choreographed by fate itself. Crenshaw, emboldened by whiskey and confident in his superior firepower, made the fatal mistake of underestimating the man who stood before him. As he brought his rifle to bear on Joseph Crow Feather, the Lakota scout moved with fluid grace that seemed almost supernatural. In one continuous motion, he drew a long knife from his belt and sent it spinning through the air with deadly accuracy. The blade struck Crenshaw's rifle just behind the trigger guard, the impact knocking the weapon from his hands and sending it clattering across the cabin floor. Before the trader could recover from his surprise, Joseph had crossed the small space between them and struck him with a blow that sent him crashing into the cabin wall. Crenshaw slumped to the floor, unconscious, but still breathing. Joseph retrieved his knife and turned to Rebecca, who had watched the entire confrontation with a mixture of terror and amazement. "You are safe now," he said simply, as if he had just completed some routine task, rather than potentially saving her from a fate worse than death. Rebecca stared at him, struggling to process what had just happened. In the space of a few seconds, her entire situation had changed completely. The man who had seemed to hold absolute power over her destiny was now unconscious on the floor, and she was looking into the eyes of someone who had intervened on her behalf without any expectation of reward. "Why?" she managed to ask. "Why did you help me?" Joseph considered the question seriously before answering. "My people have also known what it means to be treated as property," he said, "to be bought and sold and traded as if we were animals. No one should have to endure such treatment, regardless of the color of their skin or the circumstances of their birth." Through the open cabin door, Rebecca could see other figures moving in the storm-lashed darkness. Joseph's traveling companions, who had remained outside during the confrontation but were clearly ready to provide assistance if needed. "What happens now?" Rebecca asked, suddenly aware that while her immediate danger had passed, her fundamental situation hadn't really changed. She was still hundreds of miles from home, with no money or resources, and no clear path back to anything resembling safety. Joseph looked at her with those wise, dark eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "Now," he said, "you must decide what kind of person you want to be. The frightened girl who allows others to determine her fate, or the strong woman who takes control of her own destiny." Rebecca Hawthorne stared at this unexpected savior and realized that he was offering her something she had never imagined possible: the chance to choose her own future, regardless of what others had planned for her. The storm outside was beginning to subside, and with its passing, Rebecca felt something new stirring within her heart. For the first time since her father had sold her like livestock, she dared to hope that her story might have a different ending than the one that had seemed inevitable just moments before. Joseph Crow Feather had given her more than rescue from immediate danger. He had given her the most precious gift of all, the possibility of freedom. Dawn broke clear and cold over the prairie, the violent storm of the previous night nothing more than a memory written in muddy puddles and the fresh scent of rain-washed grass. Rebecca Hawthorne stood outside the abandoned cabin, breathing deeply of air that tasted like freedom for the first time in days. Silas Crenshaw remained unconscious inside the cabin, securely bound with rope that Joseph Crow Feather had produced from his traveling supplies. The trader would live, but when he woke, he would find himself in a very different situation than the one he had expected to control. Joseph's companions had emerged from their storm shelter as the sun rose, 3 Lakota men who regarded Rebecca with curious but not unkind eyes. There was White Eagle, Joseph's uncle, a man in his 50s whose weathered face spoke of decades spent reading the wind and weather of the Great Plains. The 2 younger men were Joseph's cousins, Swift Horse, barely older than Rebecca herself, and Standing Bear, a quiet man whose intense gaze seemed to catalogue every detail of his surroundings. They spoke among themselves in their native language, clearly discussing what to do with the young white woman who had been thrust into their care. Rebecca couldn't understand their words, but she could sense the weight of the decision they faced. Helping her had been an act of humanity, but keeping her with them would bring complications that none of them had sought. Joseph translated the essence of their conversation. "My uncle asks what you wish us to do," he said. "We cannot return you to the man who held you captive, and we cannot leave you alone on the prairie to die. But traveling with us will be dangerous for all of us." Rebecca understood the dilemma. A white woman traveling with a group of Native American men would be viewed with suspicion and hostility by other settlers they might encounter. For the Lakota men, being found with her could mean accusations of kidnapping or worse, regardless of the true circumstances. "Where are you going?" she asked. "North, to the reservation lands where our people have been forced to live," White Eagle answered in careful English. "It is not a journey that white settlers would understand or approve of." The reservation. Rebecca had heard whispers about the places where the government was confining Native American tribes, but she had never given much thought to what life might be like in such places. Now she was being offered the chance to see that world firsthand, assuming she was brave enough to accept the risks involved. "What happens if I go with you?" she asked Joseph directly. His dark eyes studied her face as if searching for something. You would be under our protection, but you would also be entering a world very different from anything you have known. My people are struggling to survive on land that cannot support us, watched by soldiers who see us as a threat to be contained rather than human beings trying to preserve our way of life. Rebecca thought of the alternatives. She could ask them to take her back south toward her father's homestead, but what awaited her there? Edgar Hawthorne had made his choice clear when he sold her to Crenshaw. She could try to make her own way to some frontier town, but a 16-year-old girl alone would face dangers as bad as, or worse, than what she had already escaped. I want to go with you, she said, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. If you'll have me. Joseph translated her words to his companions, and she watched their faces carefully for any sign of their reaction. Swift Horse looked skeptical. Standing Bear remained impassive, but White Eagle nodded slowly, as if he had expected this outcome. Then you will need to learn quickly, Joseph said. The way we travel, the way we survive, the way we see the world, all of it will be new to you. Are you prepared for that? Rebecca looked back at the cabin where Crenshaw lay bound and unconscious, then at the vast expanse of prairie stretching in all directions. I'm prepared to learn, she said. The education began immediately. Rebecca's small bundle of possessions was examined and found largely useless for the kind of travel that lay ahead. Her heavy dress, designed for the settled life of a homestead, would be a burden on the trail. Her few books, precious as they were to her, would add unnecessary weight to their packs. White Eagle's wife had died several winters past, but he still carried some of her clothing in his pack, practical garments made from doeskin and decorated with beautiful beadwork that told stories Rebecca was only beginning to understand. The clothes fit her reasonably well, and for the first time since leaving her father's homestead, she felt truly comfortable in what she wore. You move differently in these clothes, Joseph observed as they prepared to break camp. More like you belong in this world. Rebecca looked down at herself, surprised by how natural the native garments felt against her skin. The doeskin was soft and supple, allowing freedom of movement that her heavy cotton dresses had never permitted. The beadwork caught the morning sunlight, creating patterns that seemed to shift and dance with her movements. They're beautiful, she said, running her fingers over the intricate designs. What do the patterns mean? Swift Horse spoke up for the first time since they had been introduced. They tell the story of a woman who was brave enough to leave everything she knew to follow her heart into the unknown, he said in English that was better than Rebecca had expected. My aunt wore them when she married my uncle and came to live with his band. The parallel wasn't lost on Rebecca. Like White Eagle's wife, she was leaving behind everything familiar to enter a world she didn't understand. The difference was that the other woman had made her choice freely, while Rebecca's choice had been forced upon her by circumstances beyond her control. As they began their journey north, Rebecca quickly discovered that traveling with the Lakota required skills she had never needed on her family's homestead. These men moved across the prairie with an efficiency born of generations of nomadic life, reading signs in the landscape that were invisible to her untrained eyes. Joseph patiently began teaching her to see what he saw, the subtle differences in grass color that indicated water sources, the patterns of animal tracks that told stories about the creatures that shared this vast landscape, the way clouds formed and moved that predicted changes in weather hours before they arrived. The land speaks to those who know how to listen, he explained as they walked. Your people see it as something to be conquered and owned. My people see it as a living thing that provides for us if we respect it and learn from it. Rebecca found herself fascinated by this different way of understanding the world around her. On her father's homestead, the land had been viewed as an enemy to be subdued through hard work and determination. Here, it was seen as a partner in survival, offering gifts to those wise enough to recognize and accept them. On their third day of travel, they came upon a sacred site, a circle of ancient stones arranged on a hilltop that commanded a view of the surrounding prairie for miles in every direction. White Eagle called a halt to their journey and spoke earnestly with Joseph in their native language. "My uncle says this is a place of power," Joseph explained to Rebekah, "a place where young people of our tribe come to seek visions that will guide their adult lives. He believes you should spend time here to understand what path your life should take now that you are free to choose." Rebekah looked at the circle of weathered stones, some as tall as a person, others barely rising above the prairie grass. There was something about the place that made her skin prickle with awareness, as if the very air held secrets waiting to be discovered. "What would I need to do?" she asked. "Sit in the circle from sunset to sunrise," White Eagle answered in his careful English. "Fast and pray and listen to what the spirits tell you about your destiny." The idea both frightened and intrigued Rebekah. Her Christian upbringing had taught her to be wary of what her people called heathen practices, but her recent experiences had shaken her faith in many of the certainties she had once held. If the spirits of this place could offer guidance about her future, she was willing to listen. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Rebekah took her place in the center of the stone circle. Joseph and his companions made their own camp a respectful distance away, close enough to provide protection, but far enough to allow her the solitude necessary for whatever visions might come. The night that followed was unlike anything Rebekah had ever experienced. As darkness settled over the prairie, the stone circle seemed to come alive with energies she could feel but not see. The stars above appeared brighter and closer than ever before, and the wind through the grass carried sounds that might have been voices speaking in languages older than human memory. Rebekah had expected to feel frightened or lonely during her vigil, but instead she found herself filled with a strange sense of peace. For the first time since her father had betrayed her trust, she felt truly safe. Not because she was protected by others, but because she was connected to something larger than her individual fears and desires. As the hours passed, images began forming in her mind. She saw herself not as the victim of circumstance she had believed herself to be, but as a woman capable of shaping her own destiny. She saw the possibility of a life lived according to her own values rather than the expectations others had placed upon her. Most clearly, she saw Joseph Crowfeather, not as her rescuer, but as her partner in building something new and meaningful from the ashes of her old life. When the sun rose over the prairie, Rebekah emerged from her night in the stone. Circle fundamentally changed. The frightened girl who had been sold by her father was gone, replaced by a young woman who understood her own strength and worth. Joseph was waiting for her at the edge of the circle, his dark eyes searching her face for signs of what she had experienced during her vigil. "What did you see?" he asked gently. Rebekah considered how to put her visions into words. "I saw that my father's betrayal wasn't the end of my story," she said slowly. "It was the beginning of something I never could have imagined if I had remained in the life he planned for me." Joseph nodded, as if her words confirmed something he had hoped to hear. "And what do you choose now that you understand your own power?" Rebekah looked north toward the reservation lands, where Joseph's people struggled to maintain their identity and dignity in the face of overwhelming challenges. Then she looked at Joseph himself, seeing not just the man who had saved her from Crenshaw's brutality, but someone whose vision of the world aligned with her own newly awakened understanding of what life could be. "I choose to learn," she said, "to become someone worthy of the freedom you've given me, and to help your people however I can, because their struggle is also mine now." Joseph's smile was like sunrise breaking over the endless prairie. "Then we are no longer traveling toward an uncertain future," he said. "We are traveling toward home." As they rejoined White Eagle, Swift Horse and Standing Bear, Rebecca felt the last ties to her old life finally breaking away. She was no longer Rebecca Hawthorne, the homesteader's daughter who had been sold like livestock. She was becoming someone new, a woman who had chosen her own path and was ready to walk it with courage and determination. The reservation that awaited them would bring new challenges and hardships she couldn't yet imagine. But she would face them as a free woman, surrounded by people who valued her for who she was, rather than what she could provide them. For the first time in her life, Rebecca understood what it meant to truly belong somewhere, not because she had been born into it or sold into it, but because she had chosen it with her whole heart. The Pine Ridge Reservation stretched before them like a landscape of broken promises, where the endless freedom of the Great Plains met the harsh reality of government containment. Rebecca had imagined many things during their journey north, but nothing had prepared her for the sight that greeted them as they crested the final hill overlooking their destination. Below them lay a collection of hastily constructed buildings, wooden structures that looked more like military barracks than homes, arranged in rigid rows that spoke of bureaucratic planning rather than human comfort. Beyond the buildings, she could see small plots of farmland, carved from prairie that had never been meant for agriculture, the soil already showing signs of erosion and depletion. Most shocking of all were the people themselves. Rebecca had expected to see the proud, free spirits she had come to know in Joseph and his companions. Instead, she saw men and women moving with the defeated posture of those whose spirits had been systematically broken. Children played listlessly in the dusty spaces between buildings, their games lacking the joyful energy that should have been their birthright. "This is what your government calls mercy," Joseph said quietly, his voice carrying a bitterness Rebecca had never heard from him before. "They take everything from us, our land, our buffalo, our freedom, and then offer us this place as compensation." White Eagle spoke in Lakota, his words sharp with anger and grief. Joseph translated, "My uncle says they have turned warriors into beggars, hunters into farmers on land that cannot grow enough food to feed a rabbit." Rebecca felt a crushing weight of shame settle on her shoulders. These were her people, white settlers and government officials who had created this place of despair. The beautiful, free life she had glimpsed during their journey existed only in the spaces between the reservation boundaries, spaces that were shrinking every year as more settlers claimed the open prairie for themselves. As they approached the main settlement, curious faces began appearing at windows and doorways. Word of their arrival spread quickly through the community, and Rebecca could hear the whispered conversations that followed their small group as they made their way toward the building that served as the tribal council hall. The whispers were about her, she realized. A white woman traveling freely with Lakota men was something these people had never seen before, and she could sense both curiosity and suspicion in the glances directed her way. Chief Red Cloud emerged from the council hall as they approached, a man whose presence commanded immediate respect despite the humble surroundings. He was older than Rebecca had expected, perhaps in his 60s, with silver-streaked hair and eyes that held the accumulated wisdom and sorrow of a leader who had watched his people's world crumble around them. The chief spoke with White Eagle, and Joseph in rapid Lakota, occasionally glancing at Rebecca with an expression she couldn't read. She understood that her presence here was unprecedented and potentially problematic for people who were already walking a careful line between survival and resistance. Finally, Red Cloud addressed her directly in English that was formal but clear. "Joseph Crowfeather tells me you seek sanctuary among us," he said. "But you must understand that bringing a white woman into our community creates dangers for all of us. Rebecca had been thinking about this moment throughout their journey, knowing that she would need to justify her presence among people who had every reason to distrust her race. "I understand the risks, Chief Red Cloud," she said, meeting his gaze directly. "But I also understand what it means to be treated as property, to have others decide your fate without your consent. Your people and I share more than you might think." The chief's weathered face showed no emotion, but she sensed that her words had made some impression. "The Indian agent comes here twice each month," he explained. "If he finds you among us, he will assume you were taken against your will. This could bring soldiers, could bring punishment for our entire community." Joseph stepped forward. "She saved herself before we found her," he said. "She fought the man who held her captive, drew blood defending her honor. She has warrior spirit, even if she was born with white skin." Rebecca felt heat rise in her cheeks at Joseph's description of her encounter with Crenshaw, but she also felt a surge of pride. She had fought for herself, had refused to be a passive victim even in her darkest moment. Red Cloud studied her for a long moment, then spoke again. "You wish to stay among us permanently?" he asked. "To share our hardships as well as our protection?" "I do," Rebecca replied without hesitation. "I have nowhere else to go, and more importantly, I don't want to go anywhere else. I've learned things traveling with Joseph and his family that I could never have learned in the white world. I want to keep learning." What followed was unlike anything Rebecca had experienced in her brief but eventful life. Rather than being assigned a place to live or a role to fill, she found herself facing a series of informal tests that would determine whether the community would accept her as more than just a temporary guest. The women of the tribe were the first to evaluate her, approaching with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism that reminded Rebecca of the way farm wives back home might examine a new horse before deciding whether it was worth the feed it would consume. Morning Star, the chief's daughter, became Rebecca's primary guide through this process of evaluation. She was a woman of perhaps 30 years, with intelligent eyes and hands that bore the calluses of hard work. Unlike many of the reservation residents, Morning Star carried herself with a dignity that government policies hadn't managed to break. "Can you work?" Morning Star asked bluntly as she led Rebecca toward the women's area of the settlement. "Or are you one of those white women who thinks her pale skin makes her too delicate for real labor?" Rebecca almost smiled at the question. "I've been working since I was old enough to hold a broom," she replied. "My mother died when I was 12, and I've been managing a household ever since." Morning Star nodded approvingly. "Good. Here, everyone works or everyone starves. The government gives us just enough supplies to keep us alive, not enough to keep us comfortable." The test began immediately. Rebecca was handed a large wooden paddle and directed to a group of women who were grinding corn using traditional methods that predated any technology she had ever seen. The work was backbreaking, requiring rhythm and endurance that pushed her physical limits within the first hour. But Rebecca had learned something important during her vision quest at the stone circle. She was stronger than she had ever realized. As the hours passed and her back ached and her arms burned with fatigue, she found reserves of determination that carried her through tasks that would have defeated the pampered girl she had once been. By evening, her hands were blistered and her shoulders screamed with pain, but she had ground more corn than several of the other women, including some who had been doing this work their entire lives. More importantly, she had proven that she understood the price of acceptance in this community. The second test came unexpectedly when a child in the community fell seriously ill with a fever that threatened to take his life. The reservation's medical care was minimal. A government doctor visited occasionally, but most health crises had to be handled using traditional methods that combined herbal medicine with spiritual healing. Rebecca found herself called to assist Morning Star, who served as one of the community's healers. The work required her to overcome both her inexperience with Lakota medical practices and her own cultural prejudices about what constituted legitimate healing. White medicine treats symptoms, Morningstar explained as they prepared various herbal remedies. Our medicine treats the whole person, body, mind, and spirit together. Rebecca watched carefully as Morningstar worked, learning to prepare poultices and teas from plants she had never seen before, each chosen for properties that addressed not just the child's fever, but the spiritual imbalance that traditional Lakota beliefs saw as the root cause of all illness. When the child's fever finally broke after 2 days of intensive care, Rebecca felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond simple pride in work well done. She had helped save a life using methods her former community would have dismissed as superstition, and in doing so, she had discovered healing traditions that were both ancient and remarkably effective. As her second week on the reservation drew to a close, Rebecca found herself summoned to another meeting with Chief Red Cloud. This time, however, the gathering included not just the chief, but several other tribal elders, along with Joseph and his family. The formal nature of the meeting told Rebecca that some decision had been reached about her future, though she couldn't tell from the faces around her whether that decision would be welcome or devastating. Chief Red Cloud spoke first, his words carrying the weight of careful consideration. You have worked beside our women, learned from our healers, and shown respect for our ways, he said, but accepting you permanently into our community requires more than your willingness to work and learn. Rebecca's heart began racing as she sensed the crucial nature of whatever came next. If you stay among us, you become one of us in the eyes of our enemies, as well as our friends, the chief continued. You share our dangers, our poverty, our uncertain future. When soldiers come, and they will come, you will be seen as a traitor to your race. When white settlers look at you, they will see someone who has chosen the Indian way over civilization. Are you prepared for that? Rebecca looked around the circle of faces. Morning Star, who had become like an older sister. White Eagle, who had shared stories of the old days when the Lakota roamed free. Swift Horse and Standing Bear, who had begun treating her like family. And Joseph, whose dark eyes held depths of feeling she was only beginning to understand. I am prepared, she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was choosing. I've already lost one family to the greed and cruelty of the white world. I don't want to lose another family to fear. Chief Red Cloud nodded slowly. And for the first time since she had met him, Rebecca saw something that might have been a smile cross his weathered features. Then you are no longer Rebecca Hawthorne, the white girl who came to us seeking shelter, he said. You are brave heart woman, daughter of this tribe, sister to our people, and granddaughter to all who came before us. As the words were spoken, Rebecca felt the final threads connecting her to her old life finally snap. She was no longer the frightened teenager who had been sold by her father for horses. She was brave heart woman, and she had found her true home among people who valued courage over comfort and honor over safety. 6 months had passed since Rebecca became Braveheart Woman, and she had settled into the rhythm of reservation life with a contentment she had never imagined possible. The harsh winter had tested everyone's endurance, but spring brought renewed hope and the promise of better times ahead. She was working in the communal garden, teaching some of the younger women techniques for improving crop yields that she had learned from her father's farming, when the sound of approaching horses sent a chill down her spine. Visitors to the reservation usually meant trouble. Government officials with new restrictions, soldiers with accusations, or traders looking to exploit the community's poverty. But these horses carried a different kind of threat. As the riders crested the hill overlooking the settlement, Rebecca's blood turned to ice water in her veins. Leading the group was a man she recognized immediately, despite the months that had passed. Silas Crenshaw, his face bearing a jagged scar where her pottery shard had cut him during their struggle in the abandoned cabin. Beside Crenshaw rode another, man Rebecca didn't recognize, but whose expensive clothing and air of authority marked him as someone with significant power and influence. Behind them came 4 armed men who looked like the kind of hired guns that wealthy men employed when they wanted problems solved permanently. Morning Star appeared at Rebecca's side, instantly recognizing the danger. "You know these men?" she asked in a low voice. "The one with the scar tried to rape me," Rebecca whispered back. "The other must be Harcourt, the man my father sold me to." Word of the approaching riders spread through the settlement with the speed of wildfire. Within minutes, Joseph had appeared with several other young warriors, their faces grim with the knowledge that whatever these white men wanted, it would not be good for their community. Chief Red Cloud emerged from the council hall, his weathered face showing no emotion as he watched the riders approach. But Rebecca had learned to read the subtle signs of tension in the old chief's posture, and she could see that he was preparing for the worst kind of confrontation. Bartholomew Harcourt dismounted near the council hall with the casual arrogance of a man who had never doubted his right to take whatever he wanted. He was younger than Rebecca had expected, perhaps 40 years old, with the pale, soft look of someone who had never performed physical labor. But his cold grey eyes held a calculating intelligence that made him far more dangerous than mere physical strength could have made him. "I am looking for a young woman who was stolen from my associate several months ago," Harcourt announced, in a voice that carried clearly across the settlement. "A white girl named Rebecca Hawthorne, who belongs to me by legal right of purchase, Chief." Red Cloud stepped forward, his dignity intact despite the inflammatory nature of Harcourt's words. "No one here belongs to anyone else," he replied calmly. "We are all free people living on land granted to us by treaty with your government." Harcourt's smile was as cold as winter wind. "Treaties can be renegotiated, Chief, especially when tribes are harboring fugitives and stolen property." He gestured toward Crenshaw. "My associate here has sworn statements that the girl was taken from him by force, and I have documents proving my legal ownership of her contract." Rebecca felt Joseph move closer to her side, his presence both comforting and terrifying. If violence erupted, she knew he would fight to protect her, but she also knew that such a fight would bring disaster down on the entire community. "What do you want?" Chief Red Cloud asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer would be unacceptable. "Simple enough," Harcourt replied. "Return my property to me, and I'll forget that this community assisted in her theft. Refuse, and I'll bring the full weight of territorial law down on this reservation. I have friends in Washington who would be very interested to learn that Pine Ridge is harboring white captives." The threat was clear and devastating. Even false accusations of kidnapping could bring military intervention that would destroy the fragile stability the community had managed to maintain. Rebecca realized with growing horror that her presence here was endangering everyone she had come to love as family. That evening, the tribal council convened in emergency session to discuss Harcourt's ultimatum. Rebecca sat in the circle with the other community leaders, her newly granted status as brave heart woman, giving her the right to participate in decisions that affected the tribe's welfare. The debate was painful to witness. Some council members argued for resistance, pointing out that surrendering to Harcourt's demands would set a dangerous precedent that could be used to justify future attacks on their sovereignty. Others advocated for compliance, fearing that military intervention would bring suffering to hundreds of innocent people. Joseph spoke with passionate intensity about the moral impossibility of returning Rebecca to a man who would certainly abuse or kill her. "She is our sister now," he declared. "We do not abandon family to save ourselves from danger." But White Eagle, despite his love for Rebecca, voiced the cruel logic of survival. One person's life cannot be weighed against the survival of our entire community, he said sadly. "If soldiers come, children will die. Elders will die. The choice is terrible, but it is also clear." Rebecca listened to the debate with a growing sense of certainty about what she had to do. These people had given her everything: a new name, a new family, a sense of belonging she had never known before. She could not allow her presence to destroy the community that had saved her soul. "I have something to say," she announced, her voice cutting through the heated discussion. The council fell silent, all eyes turning to the young woman who had become one of them through courage and dedication rather than birth. "Harcourt is right about one thing," she said quietly. "I am a danger to all of you as long as I remain here, but he's wrong about something else. I don't belong to him or to anyone else. I belong to myself, and I choose what happens to my life." Joseph started to protest, but Rebecca held up her hand to stop him. "I won't be the reason soldiers come to destroy this place," she continued, "but I also won't go quietly back to the life others have planned for me." She looked around the circle of faces, people who had become her true family in ways her blood relatives had never been. "I'm going to leave Pine Ridge tomorrow morning," she announced. "Not with Harcourt and not as his property. I'm going to disappear into the wilderness, and when I don't appear at his rendezvous, he'll have to choose between staying here to search for me or giving up and going home." Rebecca spent her last night on the reservation saying goodbye to the life she was about to abandon once again. But this time, the leaving felt different. She wasn't being taken away against her will or driven out by forces beyond her control. She was making a conscious choice to sacrifice her own happiness to protect people she loved. Morning Star came to her lodge as she prepared for the journey ahead. "You don't have to do this alone," she said softly. "There are places in the mountains where our people have hidden before. Caves and valleys where you could wait until this man gives up and goes home." Rebecca shook her head. "If I hide nearby, he'll know I'm still in the area. He'll use that as an excuse to bring soldiers to tear this place apart looking for me. The only way to protect everyone is to disappear completely." Joseph appeared in the doorway, his face etched with pain and anger. "This is not justice," he said fiercely. "You should not have to sacrifice yourself to save us from that man's threats." Rebecca turned to face him, seeing in his dark eyes all the love and protection he had offered her since the night he rescued her from Crenshaw's brutality. "Justice isn't always possible," she replied. "But choosing to protect the people you love, that's always possible." She reached out and took his hands, feeling the strength and gentleness that had first drawn her to him. "You gave me something more precious than my life," she said. "You gave me the knowledge that I'm worth saving, worth protecting, worth loving. No one can take that away from me now, no matter what happens." As dawn approached, Rebecca prepared to walk away from the only home she had ever chosen for herself. But this time, she walked away as brave heartwoman, not as a victim, but as a warrior making the ultimate sacrifice to protect her tribe. The girl who had been sold for horses was gone forever, replaced by a woman who understood that true freedom sometimes meant giving up everything to preserve what mattered most. Rebecca had been living alone in the Badlands for 3 weeks when she realized she was being tracked. The harsh landscape of twisted rock formations and hidden canyons had provided perfect concealment from Harcourt's search parties, but now someone with superior tracking skills was closing in on her location. She had survived by using everything Joseph and his family had taught her about reading the land and finding sustenance in the wilderness. Rain collected in rock pools provided water, and she had learned to identify the plants and roots that could sustain life in this desolate place. But survival and evasion were taking their toll. She had lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, and the constant stress of hiding was wearing down her reserves of strength. The tracker, following her, moved like smoke through the canyons, visible only as displaced stones and bent grass that might have been caused by wind to less experienced eyes. But Rebecca had learned to see what others missed during her time with the Lakota, and she knew that whoever pursued her possessed skills that matched or exceeded her own. As evening shadows began pooling in the canyon where she had made her temporary shelter, Rebecca heard the soft footfall of someone approaching her hiding place. She gripped the knife Morningstar had given her as a parting gift, prepared to fight for her freedom one final time. But the figure that emerged from the twilight was not one of Harcourt's hired killers. It was Joseph Crow Feather, moving with the fluid grace she remembered so well, his dark eyes scanning the canyon until they found her crouched among the rocks. "You are a difficult woman to find," he said softly, as if they were meeting for a casual conversation rather than a reunion in the middle of a wilderness that had nearly claimed her life. Rebecca felt tears she had been holding back for weeks finally spilled down her cheeks. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. "If Harcourt's men find you—" "Harcourt's men are no longer a concern," Joseph replied, settling down beside her with the easy familiarity of someone who belonged in wild places. "They gave up their search 2 weeks ago and returned east. Harcourt himself departed 3 days later, claiming his business interests required his attention elsewhere." The news hit Rebecca like a physical blow. She had sacrificed everything: her new home, her adopted family, her chance at happiness, to protect the reservation from Harcourt's threats. To learn that those threats had been withdrawn made her wonder if her sacrifice had been necessary after all. Joseph seemed to read her thoughts. "Your leaving accomplished exactly what you intended," he said gently. "Harcourt had no justification for bringing soldiers to the reservation once you were no longer there. His threats were empty without you as evidence of his claims." As they shared what little food Rebecca had managed to gather, Joseph told her the story of what had happened. After her departure, Chief Red Cloud had played a masterful game of diplomatic chess, using Harcourt's own impatience against him. "The chief invited the territorial governor to visit the reservation," Joseph explained. "Told him that important white businessman was making serious accusations about our people harboring fugitives. The governor came to investigate, expecting to find evidence that would justify military action." Rebecca listened with growing amazement as Joseph described how the entire community had cooperated in a performance designed to demonstrate their peaceful intentions and law-abiding nature. Gardens were showcased, children recited lessons they had learned in the government school, and elders spoke eloquently about their desire to live in harmony with their white neighbors. When the governor found no trace of any white captives, because you had already left, Harcourt's accusations began to look like the ravings of a disappointed businessman rather than legitimate concerns about law and order. Joseph continued. The governor warned Harcourt that false accusations against government treaties could result in serious legal consequences. Faced with official skepticism and the threat of legal problems, Harcourt had chosen to cut his losses and abandon his pursuit. The reservation was safe, but at the cost of Rebecca's exile from the only place she had ever truly belonged. As the stars emerged in the clear desert sky, Joseph moved closer to where Rebecca sat, gazing into their small fire. When he spoke again, his voice carried a seriousness that made her heart begin racing. "I have come to bring you home," he said simply, "but I have also come to ask you a question that will determine what home means for both of us." Rebecca turned, to look at him, seeing something in his expression that made her breath catch in her throat. "Brave heart, woman," he said, using her Lakota name with the formal tone reserved for important occasions. "Will you consent to become my wife? Not because you need protection or shelter, but because I cannot imagine a future that doesn't include you as my partner in all things." The proposal was everything Rebecca had dreamed of during the lonely weeks in the wilderness, but it also raised questions she had been avoiding. "What about the differences between us?" she asked. "I'm still white, still an outsider who brings complications wherever she goes." Joseph's smile was gentle but confident. "You stopped being an outsider the moment you chose to sacrifice yourself." "For our people," he replied. "And as for being white," he gestured toward the vast landscape around them. "Does the sky care what color the earth is beneath it? Does the river ask permission from the rocks before it flows over them? Love is like water. It finds its own level regardless of the obstacles in its path." Rebecca's answer came not in words, but in the way she moved into Joseph's arms, feeling for the first time in weeks that she was exactly where she belonged. The desert night was cold, but the warmth between them was enough to chase away any chill. They were married 1 week later, in a ceremony that blended Lakota traditions with personal elements that reflected their unique journey together. Chief Red Cloud presided over the ritual, speaking words that honored both the ancient customs of the tribe and the exceptional circumstances that had brought this couple together. Morning Star had prepared Rebecca's wedding garments, duskskin, decorated with intricate beadwork that told the story of a woman who had traveled from one world to another and found her true home in the space between them. Joseph wore the traditional regalia of a Lakota warrior, but he also carried Rebecca's father's old hunting knife, a gesture of reconciliation with the past that had shaped them both. The celebration that followed was unlike anything Rebecca could have imagined during her sheltered childhood on her father's homestead. The entire community participated in dancing, singing, and storytelling that continued through the night and into the following morning. She was no longer Braveheart Woman, the refugee, or Rebecca Hawthorne, the sole daughter. She was simply a beloved member of a family that had chosen her as completely as she had chosen them. Years later, as Rebecca, now known throughout the territory as Braveheart Woman, taught her own children the lessons she had learned about survival, dignity, and the courage required to forge your own destiny, she would sometimes think about the frightened 16-year-old girl who had been sold by her father for horses. That girl's story had seemed to end in betrayal and despair, but it had actually been the beginning of something far more beautiful than anything she could have imagined from within the narrow confines of her original life. She had learned that families are not just the people you are born to, but the people who choose to love you when you have nothing left to offer but your authentic self. She had discovered that home is not a place on a map, but a feeling of belonging that can be created anywhere with the right people. Most importantly, she had found that strength is not the absence of vulnerability, but the courage to continue growing and loving despite all the ways the world can break your heart. The 16-year-old girl who had been traded for horses was gone forever, replaced by a woman who understood that the most powerful transformations often begin with the most devastating losses. In losing everything she thought she wanted, Rebecca had found everything she actually needed, and in the end, that made all the difference. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.